Baby found German Shepherd carrying a shoe. What she did next left everyone in tears. It started with silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that screams something is terribly wrong. And then, one tiny act of courage shattered that silence. What this little girl discovered behind an abandoned wall shocked her family, her town, and eventually the entire nation. Get ready. This is not just a story, it's a heartbeat. The sun had barely risen over Maplewood, the kind of American small town where the streets stay empty until the coffee pots start percolating and the bakery's warm rolls make their way to front porches. A thin morning mist clung stubbornly to the asphalt, softening the edges of the world. Porch steps were slick with dew, and somewhere far off, a train's lonely whistle bled into the stillness. On the front lawn of a white-painted farmhouse, a little girl sat cross-legged in the damp grass. Her name was Ellie, 3 years old, cheeks flushed pink from the cold, her tiny hands busy lining up plastic animals in a crooked parade. She was humming a tune only she knew, her voice so faint it seemed the mist might swallow it whole. That was when she saw it. From the curtain of fog at the end of the street, a shape emerged, slow, deliberate, almost spectral. At first, Ellie thought it might be one of the neighborhood's big kids in a costume. But then the shape took form, a German Shepherd, larger than any dog she'd ever seen up close. Its fur was tangled, streaked with mud and burrs. One ear stood proud while the other folded halfway down. Its gait had a slight hitch, a limp, but there was something in its eyes that outshone the weariness in its body. Clamped gently between its jaws was an old leather shoe. The laces dangled loose, brushing the pavement with every step. The shoe was worn thin, the heel scuffed, the leather cracked like the surface of dry earth. It didn't belong to anyone Ellie knew. She froze, not from fear, but from a strange, inexplicable pull. Her small head tilted, eyes locking on the dog's face. The animal stopped a few yards from her, studying her in return. The street was silent except for the sound of their breathing, hers light and quick, his deep and steady. The dog's chest rose and fell. Then, with slow, deliberate care, she walked toward Ellie. Each step seemed weighed down by something heavier than her own tired legs. When she reached the edge of the lawn, the dog lowered her head and set the shoe gently at the little girl's feet. She didn't growl. She didn't bark. She just looked at Ellie in a way that felt almost human, her eyes holding a mixture of urgency and hope. Ellie's small fingers reached for the shoe. It was cold, damp, and faintly smelled of earth and something else, something metallic like old coins. When she looked up, the German Shepherd had already taken a step back, her gaze fixed toward the narrow path leading into the woods beyond the last row of houses. Ellie glanced over her shoulder toward the farmhouse. The front door was still closed, the curtains drawn. The grown-ups were inside, unaware. She turned back to the dog. The shepherd took a step toward the woods, then paused, glancing back as if to say, "Come on. Follow me." Ellie didn't understand why her chest felt tight, why her little hands gripped the shoe as if it were something precious. She only knew that the dog needed her. It was as if this strange, weary creature had chosen her, out of all the people in the world, to see what no one else would. The dog's breath came out in a cloud, white against the gray morning. Her tail gave a single, cautious wag before she turned again toward the trees. Ellie would never forget the way that moment felt. The cold air, the heavy silence, and the quiet certainty that something important was about to happen. Years later, she would tell people, it was as if she knew I was her only hope. And she'd be right. What happened next would ripple through the streets of Maplewood, across front porches and kitchen tables, and into the hearts of an entire town. But that morning, all Ellie knew was this. The dog with the tired eyes had brought her a shoe and an unspoken plea for help. Maplewood woke slowly as it always did. The little town liked its mornings unhurried, the kind where the biggest sound was the distant hum of a lawnmower starting 2 streets over, or the clink of a coffee spoon in a mug. In the Wilkins farmhouse, just past the corner where the pavement turned to gravel, the day was unfolding in its familiar, comfortable way. Inside the kitchen, sunlight filtered through the gingham curtains, laying warm squares of gold across the table. The coffee pot hissed and sputtered, filling the air with that deep, rich smell that seemed to anchor the whole house. From the toaster came the faint aroma of bread turning crisp, mingled with the buttery scent of scrambled eggs on the stove. Somewhere outside, a mourning dove cooed, its low, rhythmic call weaving itself into the quiet. Ellie's mother, Claire, moved through her morning tasks without thinking, flipping the eggs, setting down a plate, checking the time on the wall clock whose gentle tick had been marking family moments for as long as she could remember. Her husband, Mark, sat at the end of the table with the local paper unfolded, reading aloud little snippets of news neither of them really needed to know, but somehow enjoyed sharing anyway. Out front, Ellie had been given her favorite kind of freedom, bare feet in the grass, a little world of make-believe spread out in front of her. Her collection of plastic farm animals stood in careful rows on the porch steps, cows next to horses, sheep next to a stubborn pig that refused to stay upright. The air was cool and damp against her skin, each blade of grass leaving a faint tickle as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She hummed softly to herself, her voice matching the lilting rhythm of the bird song overhead. Every so often, she would stop to reposition one of her animals or lean over to inspect a tiny patch of clover, pulling out a lucky 3-leaf specimen and adding it to a pile by her knee. It was the kind of morning that felt like it could last forever. And then, just as she reached for her toy lamb, something changed. It began with a flicker of movement at the far end of the street, just past where the fog still clung to the pavement like a stubborn ghost. Ellie squinted, shading her eyes with one small hand. The figure moved again, slow, deliberate, almost hesitant. Her first instinct was to stay very still. She'd been told to be cautious around strange dogs, and this was no beagle from down the block. The animal stepping out of the mist was large, its thick fur a mottled mix of tan and black, with patches where the hair was tangled and matted. One ear stood high, the other tilted as if caught in mid-listen. The German shepherd's steps were uneven, a faint limp in her right hind leg. Yet, despite the signs of fatigue, there was something steady, almost regal, in the way she carried herself. And there, held gently between her jaws, was a battered leather shoe, the laces dragging along the ground. Ellie's heart tapped a little faster. She didn't move, but she didn't look away either. From where she sat, she could see the dog's eyes, deep brown, soft yet filled with something she didn't understand. It wasn't the wild, darting look of a stray on the run. It was focused, purposeful. The dog paused at the edge of the yard, head tilted slightly as if gauging the little girl's reaction. Ellie wrapped her arms around her knees, torn between the warm urge to call out and the cooler instinct to stay silent. She had seen dogs before, of course. The Johnson's golden retriever, Max, sometimes greeted her with a wagging tail when she rode her tricycle down the block. But this was different. This dog didn't come bounding in joy or barking in warning. She stood her ground, chest rising and falling slowly, the shoe still held with careful precision. Ellie's small brow furrowed in curiosity. The fear was fading now, replaced by something stronger, the feeling that the dog had a reason for being here, a reason that somehow involved her. She set down the lamb and inched forward, bare toes pressing into the cool earth. The dog's gaze never wavered. When Ellie was close enough to see the cracks in the leather and the worn-down sole of the shoe, the shepherd lowered her head and set it down gently in the grass. Then she stepped back, her tail giving a slow, measured wag. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Ellie reached out, her fingers brushing the shoe's surface. It was damp, cool, and carried a faint scent she couldn't place, a mix of dirt, rain, and something sharp, like the way old coins smelled when her grandfather emptied his pockets. When she looked up again, the dog was already turning her head toward the narrow tree-lined path that led away from the street. She glanced back once more, eyes locking with Ellie's in a silent exchange. There was no bark, no growl, no sound at all, just that look. It was the kind of look Ellie wouldn't be able to describe for years, but she'd never forget it. Protective, calm, and urgent. Inside the farmhouse, Claire called out that breakfast was ready. Ellie didn't answer right away. Her hands still rested on the shoe, and her eyes were still following the dog, who now stood poised at the edge of the trees, waiting. Something told Ellie that the quiet, safe little bubble of her morning was about to change forever. Ellie sat in the grass with the strange shoe in her hands, her small fingers exploring its worn surface as if it were some mysterious artifact. The leather was cracked in deep lines, the color faded to a dusty brown, and the sole was so thin in places that light almost seemed to pass through it. The laces dangled like tired ribbons, frayed and knotted in one spot, as though someone had tied them in a hurry. She lifted it to her nose in that unself-conscious way children do. It smelled damp and earthy, like soil that had been turned over in the rain, with something faintly metallic beneath it, a smell that didn't belong to her yard, her house, or anything familiar. The porch door creaked behind her, and her mother's voice cut through the quiet. "Ellie, what on earth are you doing out there?" Claire stepped outside, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her gaze landing first on her daughter, then following the direction of her small arm to the German shepherd at the edge of the trees. The dog stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on the girl as though the rest of the world didn't exist. "She gave it to me," Ellie said, holding the shoe up for her mother to see. Claire let out a short laugh. "Sweetheart, dogs don't give people things. She probably just found it lying around." "No," Ellie insisted, her voice high and urgent. "She wants us to follow her." She glanced back toward the shepherd, who took a slow step backward into the shade of the trees, then stopped again, ears pricked forward. Claire sighed, moving down the porch steps toward her daughter. "Come inside. Breakfast is ready, and that shoe is filthy. We don't know where it's been." Just then, a voice called from the sidewalk. "Morning, Claire." It was Mr. Harris, their neighbor from across the street, out walking his beagle. He slowed when he caught sight of the shepherd, his brow furrowing beneath the brim of his cap. "Now there's a sight," he said. "Same dog I saw down near the old Miller barn 2 days ago. Looked like she was on a mission." Claire glanced at him. "No collar? No tag?" "Not that I noticed," he said, shifting the leash in his hand. "Didn't look wild, though. Just determined." He gave the shepherd a long, measuring look before continuing down the street, the beagle sniffing along the curb. Ellie's grip tightened on the shoe. "See? She's been trying to find someone." Before Claire could respond, another figure appeared, Mrs. Doherty from 2 houses down, her tiny terrier tucked under her arm. The two slowed when she saw the shepherd. "That dog's been hanging around for a while," she said. "I saw her by the creek last week. My husband thought she belonged to some hikers, but..." Her eyes narrowed at the sight of the shoe. "Where did you get that?" Ellie pointed. "She brought it to me." Mrs. Doherty stepped closer, peering at the object in Ellie's hands. "That's a man's shoe," she murmured, "and not one I've seen around here." She looked toward the shepherd again, who hadn't moved except for the slow sweep of her tail from side to side. "Strange." The adults exchanged glances, their voices dropping slightly, though they didn't speak the questions out loud. Where had the shoe come from? Why was the dog carrying it? And why, of all places, had she brought it here, to this yard, to this child? The morning air felt heavier now, the mist clinging stubbornly to the ground. Somewhere in the woods, a branch snapped faintly, followed by a rustle that might have been the wind or something else entirely. The shepherd's ears twitched, her gaze flicking toward the trees for just a moment before she looked back at Ellie. Claire crossed her arms, torn between irritation and unease. "It's just a coincidence, Ellie." The little girl shook her head. "No. She's asking for help. I can feel it." The words hung in the air, too serious for such a small voice. Claire opened her mouth to dismiss them, but stopped when she met the shepherd's eyes. They were deep and steady, holding no panic, only a quiet insistence. This wasn't a stray wandering for food. This was an animal with a purpose. The wind shifted again, carrying the smell of damp leaves from the woods, and with it came an unspoken weight, as if the day itself had tilted toward something unknown. The shepherd took one deliberate step toward the narrow path leading into the trees, then paused, glancing back over her shoulder. Ellie rose slowly, the shoe still clutched to her chest. "She wants us to follow her," she said again, her voice softer now, but certain in a way that made Claire's skin prickle. Behind them, the farmhouse stood warm and safe in the morning light, coffee brewing, toast cooling on the counter. Ahead, the trees loomed darker than they should have in daylight, the mist thickening just beyond the first line of trunks. Claire hesitated, caught between the comfort of the familiar and the pull of something she couldn't name. The shepherd's gaze didn't waver. Somewhere, someone might be waiting. And for reasons she couldn't explain, Claire found herself thinking, maybe the child was right. Claire stood there for a moment longer than she meant to, her arms crossed against the cool air, her eyes fixed on the German shepherd's unwavering stare. The shoe in Ellie's arms seemed to grow heavier by the second, as if it carried not just weight but a story neither of them understood yet. She should have told her daughter to go inside, should have called the local animal shelter, should have gone back to the safety of coffee and eggs. But something in that dog's gaze made all of those reasonable things feel like the wrong choice. "All right," she heard herself say, almost in a whisper. "Let's see what she wants." Ellie's head snapped up, her curls bouncing as she grinned. "We're going to follow her?" Claire nodded slowly, though her own smile didn't come so easily. "Just for a little bit. Stay close to me." The moment the words left her mouth, the shepherd turned and started down the narrow strip of pavement that led away from their street. Her limp was more noticeable now that she moved with purpose, but she didn't slow. She trotted ahead for a few yards, then glanced over her shoulder to make sure they were coming, her brown eyes flicking from mother to daughter before she pressed on. They passed the Harris house, the beagle barking from the front porch as if protesting their choice. A few steps later, the sidewalk gave way to gravel, and the tidy lawns of the neighborhood thinned into patches of wild grass and scattered weeds. The hum of traffic faded behind them, replaced by the crunch of stones underfoot and the occasional creak of a tree shifting in the breeze. Claire kept one hand on Ellie's shoulder, the other tucked into her sweater pocket. Every so often, the dog would stop at an intersection of paths, wait for them to catch up, then choose the next direction with the kind of certainty that made it impossible to believe she was wandering aimlessly. They passed the old Miller barn, its red paint faded to a dull rust, boards warped with age. A single crow sat on the roofline, watching their progress with a stillness that made Ellie squeeze her mother's hand. The shepherd didn't pause there, just gave a quick sniff toward the barn before heading for the gap in the fence line. Beyond it, the ground sloped gently down toward a narrow creek. The water moved lazily, its surface broken here and there by fallen leaves and the occasional darting minnow. Ellie wanted to stop and throw a pebble in, but Claire urged her on, her eyes scanning the opposite bank where the shepherd had already crossed a shallow spot and was waiting for them again. On the far side, the air felt cooler, heavier. The canopy overhead thickened, and the gravel path gave way to an overgrown trail carpeted with last year's leaves. Their footsteps turned soft and muffled, accompanied by the occasional snap of a twig beneath their weight. The smell of damp earth rose around them, mingled with the faint sweetness of moss and the sharper scent of pine. Every few yards, the dog would turn her head, checking their progress. Once, she even doubled back a few steps, as if to herd them along. Claire found herself watching the way her ears flicked at every sound, the way her body moved, alert but not frantic, confident but carrying an urgency that pressed against the edges of Claire's mind. They passed an old wooden fence half swallowed by vines, its slats broken and leaning. Beyond it stood the skeleton of a small shed, its roof caved in, walls tilting like they were tired of standing. Ellie slowed to look, but the shepherd gave a low woof, a sound not quite a bark, and continued on. The deeper they went, the more the world seemed to narrow. The light dimmed under the trees, the path twisting in quiet curves that made it impossible to see far ahead. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped rhythmically against a trunk, the sound carrying strangely in the stillness. Claire realized she had stopped thinking about turning back. The thought of going home without knowing what lay at the end of this path felt worse than the unease prickling at the base of her neck. Ellie seemed to feel it too. She walked without complaint, her eyes fixed on the shepherd's swaying tail just ahead. A half-mile in, they reached a clearing where the grass grew in soft tufts, dotted with tiny yellow flowers. In the center stood an old stone well, its wooden cover rotted through in places. The shepherd circled it once, nose close to the ground, then headed toward another trail leading away. Claire's eyes lingered on the well. She thought she saw a scrap of fabric caught on one of the boards, but the dog didn't stop, so neither did she. They crossed another creek, narrower than the first, the stones slick beneath their shoes. The shepherd paused on the far bank, shaking water from her paws before moving ahead. The air here smelled different, fresher somehow, but tinged with something Claire couldn't quite place, something faint and metallic. The trees began to thin, the ground leveling out. Ahead, the path dipped slightly into a hollow where the mist hung thicker, clinging low to the earth. The shepherd slowed for the first time, her head lowering as she crept forward, ears swiveling towards some point unseen. Claire felt her pulse quicken. The silence was different here, deeper. Even Ellie seemed to sense it, her small hand tightening in her mother's. And then, faint but unmistakable, a sound rose from somewhere ahead. At first Claire thought it was the wind playing tricks, a soft, wavering note that barely carried through the trees. But as they took another step, it came again. A cry. It was weak, almost swallowed by the mist, but it cut through Claire like a thread pulled taut. The shepherd froze, her ears standing tall, her eyes fixed on the hollow ahead. She glanced back at them once, then faced forward again, her whole body leaning into the pull of the sound. Somewhere in that quiet, sheltered space, someone was waiting to be found. The cry came again, fragile and uneven, like it was being carried on threads of air that might snap at any moment. Claire felt Ellie's grip tighten, her small fingers pressing into her mother's palm. The shepherd moved ahead with new urgency, slipping between two leaning pines and disappearing into the thickest patch of mist they had seen yet. They followed, the ground soft underfoot, muffled by years of fallen needles. As the fog shifted, shapes began to form, a cluster of weather-worn boards, a roofline that sagged to one side, the remains of what must have once been a shed. One wall had collapsed completely, spilling timber and rusted tools into the grass. And there, in the shadow of the broken structure, lay a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 18 or 19, her hair tangled and streaked with dirt, her skin pale beneath streaks of mud. Her eyes were half closed, lashes trembling with the effort of opening them. She was curled on her side, one arm wrapped around her middle, the other clutching something against her chest. It was a shoe, the twin to the one Ellie still carried. The shepherd was already there, lying pressed close to the girl's back, her body curved protectively around her. She lifted her head when Claire and Ellie approached, ears flicking forward, eyes sharp. For a heartbeat, Claire thought the dog might get up and block them, but she didn't move away. She simply stayed where she was, a silent sentinel. Ellie gasped softly. "Mommy, she has the other shoe." Claire was already moving forward, her knees sinking into the damp grass beside the girl. "Hey," she said gently, brushing a strand of hair from the young woman's face. "Can you hear me?" The girl's lips moved, dry and cracked. Her voice came out as little more than a whisper. "She never left me." Claire glanced at the shepherd, understanding blooming in her chest like a slow ache. This wasn't just a stray who'd wandered into their yard by chance. She'd gone for help, and somehow she'd found Ellie. "Ellie, honey, give me my phone," Claire said, her voice steady but urgent. Her daughter fumbled in her mother's sweater pocket and handed it over. Claire dialed 911, her free hand resting lightly on the girl's shoulder. The operator's voice was crisp. Claire gave quick directions, describing the path, the creek crossings, the leaning pines. She was halfway through when the girl tried to shift and gasped, her face tightening with pain. "Don't move," Claire said firmly. "Help's coming." Ellie crouched down beside her mother, setting her shoe next to the one the girl still held. The two lay side by side in the grass, scuffed leather against scuffed leather, their laces tangled as if even now they belonged together. Ellie reached out and touched the girl's arm with the softest pat, her voice small and full of certainty. "It's okay. She found us." The girl's eyes fluttered, her gaze drifting toward Ellie before closing again. Claire could feel the faint tremor in her breath. The shepherd shifted slightly, resting her head on the girl's hip, her eyes never leaving Claire's face. There was no aggression there, only watchfulness, and a wariness that didn't fade even in the presence of help. Somewhere in the distance, a siren began to wail, muffled by the trees but growing steadily louder. The shepherd's ears twitched, and she lifted her head. Claire stayed close to the girl, counting the slow, uneven rise and fall of her chest. The sound of boots crunching on leaves came first, then the flash of red through the trees as two EMTs broke into the clearing. They moved quickly but not carelessly, kneeling beside the girl, checking her pulse, speaking in low, even tones. One pulled out a blanket and draped it over her, the other setting up an oxygen mask. Claire stepped back to give them space, her arms still curled protectively around Ellie. She noticed the shepherd had moved too, not far, just a few yards back, sitting in the shadow of a pine. Her body was tense, ready to spring if needed, her gaze locked on the strangers tending to her person. "She's been here a while," one EMT murmured, glancing at the collapsed shed. "Lucky she had the dog." Claire nodded, the weight of those words settling over her. She thought about the battered shoe, the long trek through town, the way the shepherd had stopped and waited over and over to make sure they followed. The girl stirred again as they lifted her onto the stretcher, her voice rasping. "She wouldn't go." Claire stepped closer. "She's right here," she said softly, glancing toward the shepherd. The dog's tail moved once in a slow, measured sweep. Her eyes stayed fixed on the girl until the EMTs began carrying her toward the trail. Then, as if reassured by the fact that her human was finally in good hands, she followed at a distance, never too close, never letting herself be touched, but always keeping them in sight. Ellie watched her with something like awe, holding her mother's hand tight as they walked behind the stretcher. The forest seemed quieter now, but not in the peaceful way it had that morning. This quiet was heavy, full of the knowledge that something had nearly been lost. At the edge of the clearing, the shepherd paused. She let the EMTs move ahead, her gaze sweeping the space they had left behind. The broken shed, the scattered boards, the small hollow where she had kept her vigil. Only when she seemed satisfied did she step forward again, slipping back into her place just far enough behind to watch without being watched. The sharp scent of antiseptic hung in the air, softened by the faint hum of the hospital's ventilation system. Claire sat in one of the molded plastic chairs beside the bed, Ellie curled up on her lap, her small fingers playing idly with the hem of her mother's sweater. Across from them, the young woman lay propped against a stack of pillows, her skin still pale but no longer carrying the washed-out look of someone teetering between consciousness and the dark. Outside the door, a soft patter of paws moved back and forth, the shepherd pacing just out of sight. The hospital staff had agreed to let her stay in the hallway after seeing the way she refused to leave the ambulance, her body pressed stubbornly to the stretcher all the way from the trail. The girl's name was Hannah. Her voice was still rough when she spoke, but stronger than it had been in the clearing. "I'd been hiking," she began, eyes distant as if she were walking the path again in her mind. "Took the trail past the creek, near the old shed. I was trying to get back before the rain started, but I slipped on some wet rocks. Twisted my ankle bad, and when I tried to stand, I fell again." She paused, her gaze lowering to her hands. "By the time I crawled to the shed, I could barely move. My phone had no signal. It got cold fast that night." Ellie's eyes were wide. "Was the dog there?" Hannah's expression softened. "That's Daisy. She's mine. We've been together since she was a pup." She glanced toward the doorway, where the faint shadow of the shepherd moved. "I told her to go home, to get somewhere warm, but she wouldn't leave me. She lay right against me all night, keeping me warm." Claire felt her throat tighten. She pictured that long, cold vigil in the hollow, the dog's body curved protectively around her human, the way she'd seen it hours earlier. "The next morning," Hannah continued, "she just got up and trotted off. I thought maybe she'd finally gone to find food or shelter. I hated the idea of her wandering, but I didn't have the strength to stop her. Then, hours later, she came back. She had my shoe in her mouth. I didn't understand at first. But now," her voice caught slightly, "she was trying to get someone's attention. She must have carried it until she found you." Claire exchanged a look with Ellie, who clutched her mother's arm. The memory of that moment, the shepherd stepping out of the mist, the shoe placed carefully at Ellie's feet, settled differently now. It wasn't just strange or curious. It was deliberate. It was the act of an animal who understood more than most people would believe. Hannah's eyes glistened. "She saved my life. If she'd left me that night, I don't think I would have made it. And if she hadn't gone for help, I know I wouldn't have." Ellie shifted, sliding down from her mother's lap and padding softly toward the doorway. A moment later, Daisy's head appeared around the corner, her ears pricked forward. She stepped inside slowly, her nails clicking lightly against the linoleum. Hannah reached out, and Daisy came to her side, lowering her head into her human's lap with a deep sigh. One hand found the familiar fur at the back of the dog's neck, fingers curling gently. "Good girl," Hannah whispered, her voice trembling. "You never left me." The room was quiet except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Claire found herself thinking about all the things people said about dogs, loyalty, devotion, instinct, and realizing that none of those words quite captured what she had just witnessed. This wasn't just loyalty. It was a choice. Daisy had assessed her human's needs, gone in search of help, and somehow chosen the one person, a child, who would see past the strangeness and follow. Ellie knelt beside the bed, resting her small hand on Daisy's side. "She's really smart," she said solemnly. "She knew I'd listen." Claire looked at her daughter, seeing a seriousness in her eyes that didn't often appear. "Yes," she said quietly. "She knew." For a moment, the three of them simply stayed like that, Hannah stroking the dog's fur, Ellie with her palm pressed gently against her ribs, Claire watching as the connection between them seemed to wrap the room in something warmer than any blanket. In the hallway, the bustle of the hospital continued, carts rolling, voices calling, phones ringing, but inside this room, time felt slowed, drawn in close. Claire knew they'd go home soon, back to the normal rhythm of life in Maplewood. But she also knew something had shifted, that her daughter had seen an example of courage and loyalty she'd carry for the rest of her life. Daisy lifted her head then, looking from Hannah to Claire, her gaze calm and steady. There was no urgency now, no pleading, only the quiet satisfaction of a mission completed. By the next morning, the story had already begun to weave itself through Maplewood the way news always did in a small town, carried on the steam rising from coffee cups at the diner, passed along with the change at the general store, shared over back fences while laundry flapped in the sun. By mid-afternoon, the local paper's website featured a headline just beneath the weather report: "Hero Dog Leads Family to Rescue of Injured Hiker." A photo accompanied the article, Daisy sitting in the hospital hallway, her fur brushed but still carrying the faint roughness of her days in the woods, her ears tilted slightly forward, as though she were still listening for trouble. In the picture, Ellie was crouched beside her, a hand resting on the dog's side, her small face lit with the serious pride of someone who understood she had been part of something important. Neighbors began stopping by the hospital with small gestures that spoke louder than any speech. Mrs. Doherty brought a knitted blanket for Hannah, insisting the colors just felt warm. Mr. Harris appeared with a bag of biscuits from the diner, claiming they were for Hannah but somehow managing to slip Daisy a few under the table. Someone left a box of canned dog food at the front desk with a note that read simply, "For the bravest girl in town." Hannah, still propped up in her hospital bed, accepted each kindness with a quiet gratitude, her hand never straying far from Daisy's fur. The shepherd stayed as she always had, close enough to touch, watchful without being restless, her eyes following every visitor as though still measuring their intentions. Ellie visited every day with her mother. On the third visit, she marched right into the room and announced, "I'm friends with a hero now," her voice carrying that matter-of-fact tone only a child could manage. The adults laughed, but she wasn't joking. She took to telling anyone who would listen exactly how Daisy had stepped out of the fog with the shoe, exactly how she had understood what it meant, exactly how she had convinced her mother to follow. The hospital staff humored her, pausing in their rounds to hear the story again, each time with the same smiles, the same small shake of the head that said, "Only in Maplewood." Even the doctor admitted he'd never seen an animal so calm during a rescue, like she knew the job wasn't done until her person was safe, he said. Back in town, people began leaving treats and toys on the Wilkins porch for Ellie to bring to Daisy. Some came with handwritten cards, others with little drawings from local school children, stick figures of a girl and a dog, hearts floating above them, sometimes a shoe carefully drawn between them. On the Sunday after the rescue, Pastor Lewis mentioned Daisy in his sermon, speaking about loyalty and the ways love could guide us, even in the darkest places. His words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. Everyone in the congregation had heard the story by then, and many had seen Daisy for themselves, sitting in the sun outside the hospital or trotting quietly at Hannah's side during her first slow walk in the fresh air. And through it all, Daisy remained exactly as she had been from the start, humble, steady, more interested in staying close to Hannah than in basking in the attention that seemed to follow her everywhere. She accepted pats on the head with a soft wag of her tail, but her gaze always slid back to her person, as though checking, confirming, assuring herself that all was well. Ellie didn't mind sharing her friend with the rest of the town. If anything, she seemed to like that everyone knew Daisy's name now. One afternoon, as they walked out of the hospital together, Hannah leaning on crutches, Daisy pacing gently beside her, Ellie announced to a passing neighbor, "That's my friend Daisy. She's a hero. You probably read about her." The neighbor smiled, tipping his hat. "I did, young lady. You both are." The comment made Ellie beam, though she quickly added, "I just followed her. She did all the work." It was the kind of story Maplewood would tell for years, not because it was the most dramatic rescue anyone had ever seen, but because it was theirs. It belonged to their streets, their woods, their people. In a town where lives often moved quietly and steadily, it was a reminder that extraordinary things could happen in the spaces between the ordinary. As summer settled in, the days grew long and warm, and the rescue became less of breaking news and more of a treasured memory, the kind that would be brought out at barbecues and church picnics, retold each time with just a little more color, a little more warmth. But for Claire, for Ellie, for Hannah, and especially for Daisy, it wasn't just a story. It was proof of something they'd always known but had never seen so clearly, that love, whether it walks on 2 legs or 4, has a way of finding its path home. The air outside the hospital had begun to carry the first hints of autumn, that faint crispness curling at the edges of each breath. Leaves were turning early that year, splashes of gold and russet scattered among the green, some already tumbling loose to spiral down onto the sidewalks. Hannah stepped carefully down the front steps, one crutch tucked under her arm, Daisy pacing just a half step behind her. Claire and Ellie waited at the bottom, their smiles warm but touched with that quiet heaviness that comes when you know a goodbye is coming. Hannah reached them slowly, pausing for a moment to shift her weight and catch her breath. "I don't think I've said this enough," she began, her eyes on Claire. "Thank you for listening to her, for trusting her enough to follow. I owe you both more than I can ever repay." Claire shook her head gently. "You don't owe us a thing. We just happened to be there when she found us." Her gaze shifted to Daisy, who stood calm and steady, her eyes watching both women as though following the exchange. "You owe her." Hannah smiled faintly. "Every day for the rest of my life." Ellie crouched down then, patting her knees softly. Daisy's ears twitched, and she stepped forward, lowering her head until her nose was level with the little girl's hands. Ellie reached out, resting her palms against the thick fur of the dog's neck. For a long moment, they stayed like that, no movement, just the quiet exchange of something unspoken. "Will she remember me?" Ellie asked, looking up at Hannah. "She already does," Hannah replied. "And she always will." Daisy licked Ellie's fingers once, then stepped back, her tail making a slow, measured sweep. The motion felt less like a farewell and more like a promise. Hannah shifted her crutch again. "I'll be staying with my sister for a while. She's got a place near the edge of town. Big yard, plenty of space for Daisy. I've got a few months of physical therapy ahead, but I'm lucky, and I know exactly why." She reached down, brushing her fingers over Daisy's back. She never gave up. Not for 1 second. Claire glanced down at Ellie, who was still watching the shepherd as though memorizing every line of her face. "Sometimes," Claire said softly, "help comes from the most unexpected friends." Hannah smiled at that, the expression warming her tired features. "The very best kind," she agreed. They stood there a while longer, the breeze lifting strands of hair, the scent of fallen leaves mixing with the faint aroma of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. The world around them went on, cars passing, voices calling from across the square, but in that small circle of space, time felt like it had slowed, stretching just enough to hold the weight of the moment. Finally, Hannah gave a small nod, and they began walking toward the lane that would take them back to her sister's house. Daisy moved easily at her side, glancing back only once, a last check as if to be sure Claire and Ellie were still there, still safe. They watched until the pair grew smaller in the distance, framed by the arch of maple trees. The leaves above stirred in the wind, releasing a few bright fragments that drifted down like slow-motion confetti. Daisy's fur caught the sunlight in brief, golden flashes as she walked, head held level, her stride steady. At the end of the lane, where the houses gave way to open fields, Hannah and Daisy disappeared from view. The quiet that followed wasn't heavy, it was the kind that settles after something good when you're left with the warmth of knowing you were part of it. Ellie slipped her hand into her mother's. "Can we see her again someday?" Claire squeezed her fingers gently. "I think we will. But even if we don't, we'll always have this." She looked toward the place where they had vanished, the image still vivid, the young woman and her dog moving forward together, side by side. That night after dinner, Claire found Ellie at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and her box of crayons. She was drawing, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Claire leaned over to see two figures, one tall with a crutch, the other four-legged with ears pricked high, walking under a shower of falling leaves. At the bottom, in careful block letters, Ellie had written, "My friend Daisy." The next morning, Claire emailed a copy of the newspaper's article to her parents out in Ohio, telling them they had to read it. She posted it on her church group's page too, adding only a single line, "Be kind to animals. You never know when one will be kind to you." And in homes across Maplewood, people told the story again. Over breakfast, over fences, over phone lines stretched across counties. It was the kind of story worth carrying, the kind that made people pause just a little longer when they saw a dog waiting patiently at the edge of a yard, the kind that reminded them that loyalty has no language barrier. Because sometimes, help does come from the most unexpected friends. And sometimes, those friends walk away quietly when the job is done, leaving only the memory of what they gave and the quiet hope that you might one day return the favor. It's the connections we don't understand that make life so remarkable. If this story touched you, share your thoughts below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories. Until next time, stay curious and never stop believing.